The week I turned 18, my grandfather's lawyer called me before my own mother did. That detail tells you everything you need to know about the kind of family I come from. I was still in bed when the phone rang, a Tuesday morning in March with rain streaking the window, and the woman on the other end said her name was Helen Garrity, and that she had been waiting a long time to make this call. She said my grandfather, Thomas Weston, had left very specific instructions about when I was to be told certain things. She said I needed to come to her office before the end of the week, alone, and that what she had to tell me would change the shape of everything I thought I understood about the last 4 years of my life. I wrote her name on the back of a gas station receipt because it was the only paper near my bed. I stared at that receipt for a long time after I hung up. Downstairs, I could hear my stepfather Roy moving through the kitchen, the particular heavy way he walked when he was in a mood, the clatter of a mug set down too hard. I folded the receipt into my jacket pocket, got dressed, and went down to make my own breakfast without saying a word to anyone. I had learned a long time ago that silence was the only room in that house where I was safe. My name is Mara Weston, and at 18 I was a girl who had spent the better part of 4 years learning how to be invisible in her own home. My mother, Diane, had remarried 2 years after my father left, and Roy Callahan came into our lives with a salesman's smile and an opinion about everything. He had 2 grown kids from a previous marriage who lived in other states and called twice a year on holidays, and he had very clear ideas about how a household should run and who should be grateful for what. I was not his favorite subject. I was too quiet, he said. Too much like my grandfather, too attached to old things. He meant the workshop behind my grandparents' house on the Millbrook Road, where Thomas Weston had spent 40 years building custom furniture by hand, and where I had spent every weekend from the time I was 8 years old learning the name of every tool, the grain of every wood, the patience that goes into making something that will last longer than the person who made it. My grandfather never said he was teaching me. He just kept handing me things and showing me how they worked, and I kept showing up, and after a while the showing up itself became the lesson. My grandmother Eleanor died when I was 13, and it was the first real loss I had ever felt, the kind that takes up physical space in your chest for months afterward. My grandfather grieved in the way that quiet men do, without spectacle, continuing to go out to the workshop every morning, continuing to finish the pieces he had started, continuing to leave a light on over the back porch the way he always had. He was not a man who explained his feelings in words. He explained them in what he built and what he kept and what he gave. When he died 2 years later, just before my 16th birthday, I sat with him in his last weeks the way you sit with someone when you understand that what you're doing is saying goodbye. And I held his hand and told him about the birdhouse I was building in the workshop, and he listened with his eyes closed and smiled at the right parts. And I understood that this was love in its plainest and most complete form. The funeral was a Friday in November, gray and raw the way November tends to be in our part of the state. My mother cried in the way she cried at things, briefly and with some attention to how it looked. Roy stood with his hands folded and an expression of appropriate solemnity. Afterward, at the reception in my grandparents' house on Millbrook Road, I watched Roy walk the perimeter of the workshop with his coffee, looking at the tools on the wall the way a man looks at things when he is calculating their worth. He opened the deep drawer of the workbench, looked inside, closed it. He ran his hand along the surface of the oak cabinet my grandfather had been finishing before he got too sick to continue, the one with the hand-carved molding along the top that had taken him 4 months. Roy said nothing, just looked. I stood in the doorway and watched him looking, and felt something settle in me like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. Cold, and final, and absolutely certain. The months after the funeral were the beginning of a new kind of education. I was 16, which meant I had no legal standing over anything, no claim to the workshop or its contents or the house on Millbrook Road or the woodworking business my grandfather had built over 4 decades with a list of clients who commissioned pieces and waited a year for them because they understood that waiting was part of what made the thing worth having. What I had was a set of keys to the workshop, which my grandfather had pressed into my hand on one of those last Tuesday afternoons, and the kind of knowledge that only comes from years of showing up. I knew where every tool lived. I knew the names of his longtime clients, the Harmon family who ordered a dining table every decade, the Crestwood Inn that had commissioned 3 sets of bedroom furniture. I knew the unfinished oak cabinet in the corner was promised to a woman named Barbara Ellison, who had been waiting 14 months. I knew all of this because I had been there, week after week, learning it without being told I was learning it. Roy moved fast. That was the first thing I understood about him in the weeks after the funeral. He was not a patient man dressed up as a patient one. Within a month, he had contacted an estate liquidator about the workshop's tool inventory. Within 6 weeks, he had spoken to a commercial real estate broker about the property on Millbrook Road. He did these things without discussion, without asking my mother anything beyond a surface level, and my mother nodded along the way. She nodded along to most things Roy decided, because she was a woman who had spent a long time being tired, and Roy had initially seemed like a solution to that tiredness. And now the solution had become the weather. And you don't argue with the weather. I heard pieces of these conversations through thin walls and half-closed doors. I heard the number 280,000 used in reference to the Millbrook property. I heard the words estate auction and tool inventory and highest bidder. I did not say anything. I was 16 and had no power and no legal standing and no one in my house who would have heard me if I'd spoken. But I had Helen Garrity's name, though I didn't know it yet. I just had the keys to the workshop and 4 years of my grandfather's education in my hands, and I kept going back. Every Saturday through that winter and into the spring, I drove my bicycle the 2 miles to Millbrook Road and unlocked the workshop and worked on Barbara Ellison's cabinet. Roy hadn't touched it. I think he didn't know what it was, which told me something about how carefully he had actually looked at anything. I worked from the sketches my grandfather had left, followed his notes in the margin, matched his carving pattern on the upper molding until I couldn't tell where his work ended and mine began. I finished it in April, called Barbara Ellison from the number in my grandfather's contact book, and delivered it to her house in the truck I borrowed from my neighbor, Mr. Aldrich, who had known my grandfather for 30 years. Barbara Ellison opened her door and looked at the cabinet, and then looked at me and said, "Thomas made this. I can see him in it." I said I finished it. He got most of the way there. She put her hand on my arm and held it there for a moment, and didn't say anything else. And I understood that this was also a form of communication. The Millbrook property went on the market that summer. Roy had found a buyer, a developer who wanted to tear down the house and workshop and put in 4 townhouses with a shared driveway. The listing price was $260,000. My mother signed the paperwork with the expression of a woman doing something she had been told was practical and was working hard not to examine too closely. I was 17. I watched this happen from the edge of my own life, without the power to stop anything, and I went to the workshop one last time and sat on the stool where my grandfather used to sit to drink his coffee, and I looked at the tools on the wall, and I understood that whatever happened next, some things could not be liquidated because they already lived in me. That was the fall I found the letter. I had gone back to pack up some personal items before the estate sale. A few of my grandfather's books, the worn leather apron he had given me when I was 12. In the back of the deep drawer of the workbench, underneath a layer of old cloth, I found a sealed envelope. My name on the front in my grandfather's handwriting, the careful block print he used when he wanted something to be readable for a long time. Inside was a single card, Helen Garrity, attorney at law. Below the name, printed in small careful letters, Weston Family Trust. Underneath, a handwritten line in my grandfather's script. "Call her when you're ready. She'll know what it means." I held that card in the workshop for a long time. The estate sale was in 3 days. The developer's closing was scheduled for the following month. I put the card in my wallet, and I did not call Helen Garrity yet. Not because I was afraid, but because I was not quite ready to know the full shape of what my grandfather had done. Something in me understood that once I made that call, everything would move, and I needed one more day of not knowing. Of sitting in the workshop with the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, with the light coming through the high window the way it always had. I called on a Thursday. Helen Garrity answered before the second ring, as if she had been expecting me, which I later understood she had been in a way for 2 years. She had a steady, careful voice, the voice of a woman who chose words the way my grandfather chose wood, for grain and durability. She told me to come to her office. She said there were things she had been holding for exactly this moment, and that the timing, while not ideal, was not as catastrophic as I might fear. I drove to her office on a Saturday morning and sat across a desk covered in neat folders, and she told me what my grandfather had built in the last 2 years of his life, quietly and without telling anyone. My grandfather had established an irrevocable trust 4 years before he died, at a time when his health was still good and his mind was absolutely clear. The trust held the workshop building, the tools, the business name, the client list, the intellectual property of 40 years of designs and techniques, and a savings account he had been quietly building for a decade. He had transferred ownership of the workshop property into the trust separately from the main house, a distinction that was now everything. The main house on Millbrook Road had gone through probate and into the estate, which Roy had liquidated. But the workshop was not part of the estate. The workshop had never been part of the estate. It had been held in the Weston Family Trust for 4 years, with me as the sole beneficiary, and the conveyance had been recorded at the county clerk's office in the year my grandmother died, 2 years before my grandfather followed her. Helen Garrity slid a document across the desk with my name on the second line. I stared at it. She explained quietly that the developer's closing on the main house property could proceed, but that the workshop parcel, which was recorded separately and had a separate tax identification number, was not included in the sale because it had never been Roy's to sell. Roy had sold something he did not own. The closing was in 3 weeks. The developer did not know yet that the workshop parcel had a different owner of record. Helen was preparing to notify them. She looked at me over the edge of her glasses and said, "Your grandfather used to say that the difference between a good joint and a bad one is invisible from the outside. He built this so the seam wouldn't show until someone tried to pull it apart." I drove home in a state that I can only describe as the feeling of a house settling onto a new foundation. A shift so structural you feel it before you understand it. Roy was in the backyard when I got home, talking on the phone with the easy posture of a man whose plans were proceeding on schedule. I went inside. My mother was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a magazine. I sat down across from her and I said quietly, "I need to tell you something about Grandpa's workshop." She looked up. I told her, not everything, just the shape of it, that the workshop was in a trust, that it had always been in a trust, that it was mine. She put down the magazine. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in years, something between surprise and a much older guilt. She said, "He never told us." "I know," I said. "He never told anyone. Roy came inside 20 minutes later and my mother told him." I watched his face the way you watch a face when you need to read it accurately. The ease went out of it like air from a tire, and what was left was a calculation, fast and visible for just a moment, before the salesman's expression reassembled itself. "We'll sort this out," he said. "I'm sure there's a way to make this work for everyone." It was the first time he had used the word everyone in a sentence that included me. Helen Garrity contacted the developer that week. She filed the notice of trust ownership against the workshop parcel and informed their attorney that the parcel had never been part of the estate and was therefore not part of the sale. The developer's closing agent pulled the title on the workshop separately and found exactly what Helen had told them they would find: a trust recorded 4 years prior, clean chain of title, no encumbrances, sole beneficiary Mara Weston, age 18. The developer's attorney called Roy's attorney. Roy's attorney called Roy. I heard about this conversation third hand, through my mother, who relayed it with the careful neutrality of a woman walking a very thin line. Roy, it turned out, had listed the workshop in the property description in good faith. His attorney said, because he had not done a separate title search on the workshop parcel, because he had assumed it was part of the main property, because he had not asked and no one had told him. He had sold something that was not his to sell to a buyer who had paid a price that included a parcel he was not going to get. And the developer was not pleased, and the closing was delayed, and there were conversations about renegotiation and adjusted pricing that Roy handled behind closed doors with the tight jaw of a man absorbing consequences he had not planned for. The developer ultimately renegotiated the sale price downward to reflect the exclusion of the workshop parcel. Roy lost the difference. It was not a devastating number, but it was a real one. And more than the money, it was the particular embarrassment of having sold something in front of neighbors and family and a real estate broker that had turned out not to be his. In a small town, that embarrassment has a specific weight and it does not dissipate quickly. I turned 18 3 weeks after Helen Garrity filed the trust notice. On my birthday morning, I drove to Millbrook Road one more time, parked in the gravel drive beside the workshop, and unlocked the door with my grandfather's key. The main house was empty by then, the development company's signs already staked at the corners of the lot, but the workshop was exactly as I had left it, tools on the wall in their places. The smell of sawdust and old wood, and something underneath that I had always associated with my grandfather himself. Something I now understood was the accumulated smell of decades of careful work. I sat on his stool and drank the coffee I had brought in a thermos and looked at everything and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that I was sitting on solid ground. Helen called that afternoon. She walked me through the formal process of accepting the trust, the single document requiring my signature now that I was a legal adult, the transfer of co-decision authority, the steps for recording my formal acceptance at the county clerk's office. She also told me what my grandfather had included in the trust beyond the physical property, the client list and correspondence, 40 years of commissions and relationships, the design notebooks, 12 of them, in the locked cabinet above the workbench, and a savings account that had been quietly accumulating for a decade, earmarked in the trust documents for what my grandfather had written as continuation of the craft. The balance, with 6 years of interest, was just over $62,000. I sat with that number for a long time. I thought about the word continuation. My grandfather had not left me money to spend. He had left me money to keep building. The consequences for Roy arrived in the way that consequences tend to arrive when you have sold something that was not yours. Not all at once, but in pieces, each one with its own particular weight. The developer's attorney sent a formal letter regarding the price adjustment and the misrepresentation in the property listing. Roy's real estate broker, a man he had worked with for 15 years, had a conversation with him about the importance of title verification that Roy apparently found humbling. The story moved through town the way stories move in small places, not as a scandal exactly, but as a thing that was known, the way things become known without anyone announcing them. At the hardware store, at the diner on Route 9, at the school parking lot where my mother picked up groceries, people had known my grandfather for 40 years. They knew what he had built and what it meant, and who had been there to learn it. The version of events that circulated was accurate in its essentials. A man had tried to sell a craftsman's workshop that had been placed in trust for his granddaughter. The granddaughter had it still. My mother and I had the hardest conversation of our relationship on a Sunday evening in late April, sitting at the kitchen table after Roy had gone to a meeting. She was not a villain in this story, and I had always known that, which made it more complicated, not less. She had loved Roy and trusted his judgment, and abdicated her own in the way that people do when they are tired, and when trusting someone else feels, temporarily, like rest. She had let him make decisions about her father's legacy without asking the questions she should have asked, and she had to live with that. And I could see in her face that she was already living with it in ways she would not say aloud. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not asking her to choose. I told her that the workshop being mine did not have to be a wound between us unless we made it one. She put her hand over mine on the table and held it there and did not say anything for a while. And I let the silence be what it needed to be. I enrolled in a furniture design and fine woodworking program at the Regional Craft College 40 minutes from Millbrook Road. The tuition was covered by the continuation fund my grandfather had left. I moved into a small apartment with a weekend arrangement that let me spend 3 days a week at the workshop, continuing the commissions that had been paused for 2 years, reaching out to the clients whose names I knew from the contact book, and telling them that Weston Woodcraft was still operating under new stewardship, that the work would continue in the spirit it had always been done. The Harmon family called back within a day. Barbara Ellison sent a handwritten note. 3 other longtime clients responded within the week. The workshop was not closed. It had only been waiting. My sister, well, half-sister technically, though I never used that word. Her name was Cassie, and she was 14, and had grown up mostly in Roy's house, and known my grandfather only at the edges of visits and holidays. She came to the workshop one afternoon in May, just showed up on her bicycle with a backpack, and a slightly defiant expression that reminded me of myself at her age. She said she wanted to see what the big deal was. I handed her a piece of sandpaper and a piece of white oak, and I showed her the direction of the grain, and told her to follow it. She worked for 2 hours without complaining, and left with sawdust in her hair, and something slightly different in her eyes than what she had arrived with. She came back the following Saturday. I did not make a thing of it. I just kept handing her tools and showing her how they worked. I found my grandfather's last letter in the design notebook, tucked between the pages for the oak cabinet which I had already finished. It was undated, written in the careful block print I had known since childhood. He said he had watched me in the workshop for years, and had understood early that what I carried out of it every Saturday was not just a skill, but a way of seeing. The understanding that things made carefully and honestly have a life that extends past the person who made them. He said he knew his son-in-law would try to sell it. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it the way he said most things, plainly and without decoration. He said he had built the trust not to punish anyone but to make sure the workshop found the hands it was meant for. The last line said, "The best joint holds not because it was forced, but because it was cut true." I folded the letter and put it back between the pages of the notebook and looked out the high window at the spring light coming down through the pines and listened to the quiet of the workshop, which was a different quiet than any other kind of quiet, the quiet of a space that is full of something you can't quite name but know immediately when you're in it. I am sitting at the workbench now as I tell you this, in the early morning before the day begins. With my coffee cooling in the mug, my grandmother painted 30 years ago. The tools are on the wall in their places. The design notebooks are in the locked cabinet above the bench. Outside, the pines are sharp against the sky. My grandfather could not stop the people around him from wanting what they wanted. He could not make Roy less acquisitive, or my mother less avoidant, or the world less inclined to put a price on things before it asks what they're worth. What he could do was cut the joint true, years in advance, in a lawyer's office no one else knew about, with a careful hand and a long view, and a faith that I would show up when it mattered. I think about that a lot. The people who protect you are not always the people standing in front of you. Sometimes they are the people who built the shelter years before you knew you would need it, who trusted you with the keys before they told you what the keys were for. I kept a promise I didn't know I was making every Saturday I drove that bicycle to Millbrook Road and picked up the tools and stayed until the light changed. My grandfather saw me keeping it before I did. That's what love looks like when it knows it won't be there to explain itself. It builds something solid, and it leaves a letter, and it trusts you to find it when you're ready.